Hello and welcome to my discussion of skillful repetition and parallelism in your writing. As usual, I think it's important for you to take notes on this. This is something I'm going to expect you to use. So there are two kinds of repetition that work well in creative writing. The point, though, is that you need to use your repetition on purpose to drive home a point. And so there's lazy repetition, right? Where you just repeat a word because you're too lazy to look up a different word. And then there's actual skillful repetition where you're going to repeat a word or a phrase, like I said, just to really drive home your point and affect your reader. So you'll notice here on the slide that it says that repetition, right, is a repeating of a word or a line in a poem or speech or fiction, etc., 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 for poetic effect. Repetition needs to be on purpose to effectively drive home a point, not lazy. And just remember that you should never repeat words except on purpose. So if you're repeating words again that because you're just too lazy to look them up, that's going to have you lose points. But if you're using repetition skillfully, you'll gain points. So one really effective way to use repetition is called parallelism. Parallelism is the repeating of a sentence structure, a part of speech, or the beginning of a line for effect. So parallelism might look something like this. Love is not a requirement of your reality. Love is not a mixture of mundane words. Love is not a part-time job that you can just quit. Love is commitment. So by having those three, love is not, and then flipping it around to say love is, it really drives home your point to the reader, and especially when you do that flip around in the end. So what we're going to do next is we're going to look at a speech by Martin Luther King, because Martin Luther King is considered to be one of the experts at using parallelism or repetition in his work. So when we look at this excerpt from Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, what I want you to, I'll just have you read along with me, and then I'm going to point out where I see effective parallelism. So 50 years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. Seared in the flames, notice, this is a side note, right? But notice the metaphoric language here. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. Again, here we have metaphor being used, but I'm getting off track here. Let's talk about parallelism and repetition. But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. 100 years later, the Negro is still languished in the corners of American society and finds himself in exile in his own land. And so we've come here today to dramatize a shameful condition. So notice how King uses the but 100 years later, 100 years later, 100 years later to hold his paragraph together, and again to really drive home the length of time that has passed in the civil rights movement when there has not been change. Obviously, he is also an expert at metaphor, the vast ocean of material prosperity, a lonely island of poverty, manacles of segregation, chains of discrimination. So he takes these words, right, like discrimination, that's just like a telling word. It doesn't put an image in our mind, but he says the chains of discrimination. And so now we have this image connected to the idea. And that is one of the reasons why King is just unbelievable as a speechwriter or speaker. Okay, so let's take a look at this next paragraph as well. In a sense, we've come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Even this is skillful repetition right here, that all men, yes, black men as well as white men. You see how he's using that word men and then also continuing to use it to drive home that it should be all men. It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note, insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Notice the alliteration, color concerned. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds. So even in this sentence here, right, he says a bad check, a check which. This is also skillful repetition because he's making sure that he uses that repetition of check again to really drive home his point. And once again, right here, we have him using metaphor, comparing what America has done to the African American population and what it has given them in comparison to what it should have given them. But then he says, but we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. Bank of Justice, we have a metaphor here, right? We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity of this nation. So notice we have insufficient funds, the Bank of Justice was repeated. We refuse to believe. And so we've come to cash this check, a check that will give us, upon demand, the riches of freedom and the security of justice. We have also come to this hallowed spot to remind America of this fierce urgency of now. This is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. Now is the time to rise from the dark and desolate valley of segregation to the sunlit path of racial justice. Now is the time to lift our nation from the quicksands of racial injustice to the solid rock of brotherhood. Now is the time to make justice a reality for all of God's children. So conclusively, this use of parallelism and repetition can really help you to become an effective writer, especially in your introductions, in your conclusions, in any kind of narrative or memoir writing that you do. It's just a good writing technique that you should try to incorporate throughout your writing. But be very careful, like anything else, too much of this, or if it becomes too obvious that you're really trying to use repetition and parallelism effectively, now you have lost your reader or your listener because now they're just noticing, wow, this writer repeats themselves a lot, instead of noticing your content. You always want the ultimate focus of your reader to be on what you're trying to say, not how you're trying to say it. That's really the secret to good creative writing.